Greetings of peace and good morning from here, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're joining from. It's a great privilege to be opening up this call and on this subject with the speaker today. Just to give an orientation, this is also interactive. You're welcome to share in the chat your comments, any questions. And we will start with presentation and then some dialogue. The subject, solving the riddle, the meaning of life and the mystery of death they are of course connected, and shown beautifully in this quote by Norman Cousins, an American journalist and professor. He said that death is not the greatest loss in life. The greatest loss is what dies inside us while we live, which is quite fascinating because in this subject it raises the aspect of death, the nature of impermanence, the question of consciousness, of judgment, transcendence from fear. And just want to check that Spanish translation is working, so we may have to make some changes here. But also it raises subjects about life, which is about inner fulfillment, about learning and growth, self-discovery, but also our unity, the connection, and also with the divine, raises all of this. And I just want to share something interesting in this study, in this understanding, that near-death experiences, the term was coined by Raymond Moody. That was in 1975, and he's introduced in his book, Life After Life, gathering together experiences of people that have had similar experiences, being in the tunnel, the bright light, being outside their physical bodies. Bringing that to the attention of the public and creating discussion about the nature of consciousness and these mysteries. Yesterday, I watched a video of someone who 20 years earlier had had a very profound near-death experience, but had no language to talk about it and thought he must be crazy. It had nothing to do with what he'd been taught in school. And finally, there was a voice that explained what it was. And they say 6% of the population have had these experiences. So it's so wonderful to open up this subject, and I'm so happy to be welcoming in Charlie Hogg, who's based in Australia. He came across the BKs also in 1975, time of this book, different parallel story. That was in London. He learned to meditate with the Brahma Kumaris and is currently the director of the Rajiga Centers in Australia. And he says meditation is an extraordinary tool to manage life today. So I hope that the connection is good. Feel free, as we say, to interact in the chat. And a very warm welcome to everyone. A special warm welcome to Charlie. Good evening to you.
Hi, Sarah. Lovely to be with you. And greetings from Australia, where it's already dark. It's nighttime. Anyway, lovely to be with everybody to explore this extraordinary subject, actually. And if you'll just excuse me one sec. Yes, and I think it's a huge subject, absolutely huge subject, and I think scholars and philosophers and thinkers throughout the ages have talked so much about this, debated about this, discussed this subject. And I can't really remember why, but in my last year of school, I mainly did science subjects. But I also took Greek history, which I absolutely loved. It was my favorite subject in my last year of school. And the Greek philosophers were really an extraordinary group of people who explored this question in depth. And Aristotle once said, happiness is the meaning and purpose of life. Happiness is the meaning and purpose of life. And Socrates, a fellow philosopher, wasn't too much different. He once said that wisdom is the supreme art of happiness. I really love that the ultimate wisdom in life is really to remain happy. And I can totally relate to that, because I think if we can remain happy in this world as it is, then it needs an incredible amount of self-realization and wisdom to be there. But what is really beautiful about these comments, I find, is that, happiness is not a result or an outcome or a product or an achievement. It's a state of being in life. And it seems today we're so sort of orientated to that sort of achievement, result, focus, and yet really spirituality is really about a state of being. And yet I would say that probably one of the main reasons, excuse me, one sec, I'm sorry. One of the main reasons that, happiness is lost in life, or perhaps, one of the big obstacles for happiness, I would say, is death. And recently I met an old school friend, and we had a bit of a heart-to-heart conversation. And he's a person who's done a lot in his life. He has a good life, but he said to me openly, I'm terrified of dying. He didn't say I'm scared or fearful. He said, I'm terrified of dying. And he said, because of this incredible terror or fear of death, he said, it's like a shadow crushing the happiness of my present life, what I'm doing at the moment. And unfortunately, this is a pretty powerful culture in our present world, that the shadow of death, the sword of Damocles, sort of hangs over all of us and takes away so much enjoyment in the present. And I do have another friend in Australia who's a palliative care physician. In other words, he's dealing with people at their final moments of life. And he's often told me that when people are dying, there's two things on their minds. The first is, what sort of person have I been? What sort of person was I? So it's almost like an evaluation of me and how I've behaved in my life, a critical evaluation. The second one, the second thought on most people's minds is, how did I treat other people? And that's not an evaluation of others. It's an evaluation of me and how I dealt with others. And as he often says, when we're about to face death, all the superficial goes away, and the much more important things, or the deeper meaning of really what life is about, returns. And I, in my sort of sharing tonight, my brief sharing before we interact, I'm not going to try to solve the riddle, but I'm just going to offer, I think that could be dangerous territory. But what I'm going to do is just try to offer my journey with this riddle. Because since I can remember as a young person, I had an innate sense I had lived before. An absolutely innate sense that I have lived before, not only that I have lived before, but actually that I will continue after this body as well. And I can remember as a young person telling my parents that I had a sense that I died of a heart problem in my past life. And my parents said to me, well, how do you know that? And I said, it's not something in my conscious mind. It's come from something much deeper. I can't give you a rational explanation, but I think you all know that sense of intuitive knowing, that sense of wisdom we all hold deeply inside. And somehow, even I didn't have any idea about that. I didn't even understand the mechanism of what it is that may travel from body to body. But I would say from a child, I was fascinated by the meaning of life, and I would say the mystery of death. I've always been fascinated by those two things. And when I was just 20 years old, I was at university and I took time out. It was the 1970s. A lot of people did that. And I spent nearly 18 months traveling overland from Australia to London, actually. And that was an incredible education for me, because I went from Southeast Asia to India, to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe. But in that journey, I lived with Sikhs. I lived with Taoists in a Taoist temple. I lived with Muslims during Ramadan. I went and dipped my toes in the Ganges. I lived with Hindus. I lived with some yogis in the Himalayas. I went to where the Dalai Lama lives in India, is based at Dharamsala. And as I was doing that, this whole story, I would say, of the journey of the soul's movement through time, started to really resonate, because, as you know, in those cultures, it's a part of their culture, a part of their thinking. And in fact, nearly half the world has some understanding, half the world's population, of the soul moving from body to body through time. And I remember once, actually, in London, there was a scientist who came to speak at the Brahma Kumaris in Global House some years ago. And he took up the study of reincarnation. And he said that when he told his scientific friends in the UK that I'm studying reincarnation, they said, "Why would you study that for? Everyone knows it's not true." And then he went to India and he met with some of the scientific fraternity there. And their comment was, "Why are you studying that for? Everyone knows it's true." So it's like the different perceptions of reality in which we're all engaging with. But in my journey, I did come across the Brahma Kumaris. And I was living in London at the time. I was shopping around with many different, I suppose, perceptions, outlooks, ways of thinking. And what I was offered was such a clear idea of the entity that travels through time, the soul, if I can use that language. And I'm absolutely, till this day, fascinated by the concept of who I am, that I am a soul. And the soul is just a point. And in mathematics, a point exists, but it has no length, breadth, or width. The soul is non-physical, and yet the soul is conscious. The soul thinks and feels. And I find that absolutely extraordinary. And yet this body, the latest science says that this body is made up of about 30 trillion cells. Now, I have no idea how they count that at all, but an incredible number of little building blocks that make up this body. And yet the soul is more subtle than one of those 30 trillion cells. And if we start to move our head around the concept of the permanent self, as opposed to the concept of the temporary self, the body, I find it just takes us into a whole different perception of who I am and reality. And one of my friends in Australia is a medical scientist. And I remember once he was saying to me, he got his fist and he banged his fist on his other hand. And he said to me, "Feels solid, doesn't it?" And I said, "Yes, it feels very solid." And he said, "Actually, it's 99.99% space." And he then went on to say, in a sense, your body is a hologram. You are the permanent self, the consciousness, and you adopt this temporary hologram. And when you really think about it, that I adopt this temporary hologram and then all the labels that this represents, the gender, the nationality, the religion, the culture, the numerous labels, I begin to invest my sense of self. And yet what's common to all those labels is that they are temporary. And as we start to delve into the concept of who I am the soul, this point. The soul is immortal. The soul can never die, but the soul will leave the temporary self, the body. The soul is eternal. And that's an extraordinary thing to get the head around too. And I often feel that a lot of the fear we build up is because of my sense of loss of my body, my reputation, my relationships. And yet when we begin to really not just know, but the spiritual journey, the spiritual practice of actually converting this as a belief or an idea, even experiment with being immortal and eternal, I think it really starts to heal the account of fear, which we all carry within ourselves. And I had a job in London many, many years ago at Imperial College, the University of London. And it was actually in the physics department. And they were searching for the quark. You may remember the smallest particle at that time, but physics has gone much deeper since then. And I had to measure these sort of, they put electrons through chambers, and I had to measure the collisions of the electrons and try to find the quarks. And in talking to the scientists, I began to ask them, well, the unit of matter, what do you believe about that? And they said, we understand it to be eternal also. So all these 30 trillion little building blocks that make up this incredible temporary hologram these are eternal, but when this particular form goes, they go into different forms of matter. And this is why the Tibetan Buddhists and others, when someone dies, they used to, I've seen it in Bali as well, they used to actually take parts of the body and put some in the ground for the worms and things like that, some in the streams for the fish, some outside on the land for the birds and so on, because it's a material thing, an extraordinary instrument for the soul, but it will go back into the material as well. And so we begin to, what I found as I began to meditate, I began to build up a picture, not only of who I was, but this extraordinary journey that I was on. And the nature of the self is non-physical as opposed to physical. And this soul sits on the throne of the forehead around the pituitary gland. When you see brain scans, often when we think the light comes from this point source, sort of in the front of the brain, near the center of the forehead. I, the soul, and the consciousness, it's like I'm the program, the brain is the computer, the body is the system that it's running. And at death, the soul separates from the body. And I would say my understanding is mostly, it almost instantly moves into the womb around 4 to 6 months when the movement begins. What they call the quickening in the womb is when the soul enters. And my understanding also is that the soul at that time, I'm carrying the memories of my past life. I reflect on my past life. I have a sort of a temporary understanding. I'm something much more than a temporary body. And yet, you know, when I'm reborn again, as I take on another body, sometimes I remember something, sometimes I forget. You know, one thing common to children is imaginary friends. It's a common psychological term, but actually they're not imaginary at all. These are clear memories of personalities or even the self in my past life. And there's so many books, and even Sarah was mentioning at the beginning about Raymond Moody, of young children remembering their past lives. And I've had so many people, because I teach meditation courses, regularly tell me that they had memories in their childhood of places and people and so on that they couldn't really rationalize, but they felt were from their past life. And so as we begin to explore this incredible journey of the soul, how the soul takes on the hologram of the body, acts through it, but every body has a limited time frame. So I leave it and I take another one. You begin to see that there's probably two states of consciousness that I can have on this journey. One is perhaps what we could say is soul consciousness, which is when I remain aware of who I am, that my body is temporary. It's a wonderful vehicle. It's an instrument I use to express life, to express love, express beauty, but it is temporary. And one of the things I've always loved about Buddhism, Buddhism actually often uses the analogy that life is like a train journey. And we know on the train, the train stops at a station and people hop on a train, people hop off a train. It goes to the next station, people hop on, people hop off. This keeps going till I hop off the train, I reach my destination. And to me, it's an amazing analogy of the journey of the soul. Life is the train. People come into your life, people go out of your life. Roles, responsibilities, achievements come into your life, they go out of your life. Material things come into your life, go out of your life. But the big thing is that when I understand this process, I can enjoy people. I can enjoy my roles, my responsibilities. I can enjoy it. But when I start to attach my heart to anyone or anything temporary, that's when I begin to build suffering into my life, because I fear losing that which I become dependent on. And perhaps we could call this the second type of consciousness, is when I forget the permanent self. I may believe that I'm a soul, because 80% of people in a country like the UK or most of Europe, Australia, believe that there's something more than a body, but I don't really experience it. So when I am body conscious, as we would say, when my sense of identity is my temporary body and the labels of my body, the law of life says the more I become dependent on my bodily image, my body, my reputation, all that sort of thing, the more I build fear into my life. And I think that exploring the meaning of life, to me, in one sense, it is to remain aware as I act through my body, enjoy my body, remain aware that I'm something more than the body. I'm this incredibly subtle soul, this consciousness. And this is really, I think, the way of remaining aware of who I am, the meaning of life. But I would say death is not a mystery. For my feeling is where I'm at in my life, it's just change. Death is just change. It's the most natural thing in all natural systems, that there's birth, there's growth, there's death, but there's birth again too. And the same with the human form and the human body. As the soul takes a body, drops a body, takes a body. Sometimes I have the thought in my mind that I'm born, I say, this is my mum, this is my dad, these are my brothers, these are my sisters. I'm building an identity. This is my city, this is my country. And as I grow up, this is my profession, this is my work. And even further, this is my partner, these are my children. You think it's almost like I spend a lifetime building this sense of identity around this temporary hologram. In a second, I leave it. And my understanding is I go back into the womb, I'm reborn once again, and I go through the whole same process. This is my mother, this is my father, these are my brothers, these are my sisters. Because I've actually forgotten the relationship with the permanent self. And the meaning of life, I would say, is to really remain spiritually where that I am the soul. And the soul, really, I love the idea personally. The soul has no labels, not even gender. The soul can even swap genders from life to life. And the soul has no nationality, etc., religion, color, all these things. You think how the temporary identity of the body can influence my thinking, my life experience, my self-respect, so many things in that way. And I feel also that the soul, the consciousness, actually has control over death. You know, a friend of mine in Australia, or that friend, I actually talked about him already. He has often told me that from a medical point of view, people are ready to pass away. Doctors will say they'll go in a day or 3 or 5, maximum a week. He said, I've seen people live 6 months and longer. A child will come from the other side of the world, or someone close, they will meet them and then they go. Even I have seen the same thing myself. So to a certain extent, even now we have control. In my travels when I was younger, I was right up in Darjeeling in northeast India. And I met a young man who was my age, who was from Bhutan. He was Buddhist. And he told me that his grandfather was a devout Buddhist and told the whole family that I'm going to die on Buddha's birthday. That's what I want. And what he said was that as Buddha's birthday was coming up one year, he was elderly. He went round to all the family, community, and friends and said, I'm about to leave. It's been lovely to know you. Gave away his things. And literally on Buddha's birthday, he departed his body. So he had a sense of mastery over the temporary, the sense organs, and the body. And yet I think that sometimes we have a question. I'm not going to go on for too much longer because there'll be always lots of questions on these things. That we think, okay, if I am a soul and I adopt a body, do I have, a say in where I go? Do I select the destination of my next body? And I would say to a certain extent, yes, but not consciously. Because as we delve into this amazing sense of self, that I'm this soul, this point, this non-physical self that goes from body to body, the soul is actually an overname for 3 aspects of consciousness. I would say the mind, which the mind is that part, the conscious mind, which collects the information from the world through my sense organs. So I hear things, I see things, and it's almost like I throw it, the mind is like a screen. So all the data of life is thrown up on the screen of the mind. The intellect is that entity which is assessing and valuing and judging everything. Even as I speak, some of you are thinking, yes, I like that, I don't agree with that. That's the intellect assessing all the data. The intellect can make a decision, and I do action, I speak, and every single action is recorded in the subconscious. So the soul carries this extraordinary database of the past with me, which I understand I carry from life to life. And hence why all these in my subconscious experiences, talents, likes, dislikes, phobias. Phobias are directly connected with a past experience. There's over 400 phobias known in psychology. And originally in psychology, they thought it was inherited through family. That was a long time ago. But now it's like based on a past experience. Why is it that I am terrified of a situation and my brother or sister has no fear of that particular situation? And so even we carry talents. And I remember once I was in Oxford and a friend of mine there was a concert pianist. And he took me to a hall, and if my memory serves me correctly, and it doesn't sometimes, where Mozart played when he was like 10 or 12 years old, I forget. He was touring Europe playing his own music. And I actually read a book once, and the theme of this book, the author believed that the 30 to 40 great European composers, the Beethovens, the Mozart, the Tchaikovskys, the Chopins, are the same 4 or 5 souls taking birth and rebirth, because most of them were absolute child prodigies, just like Mozart. So we carry things forward from life to life. And I think that I find that when I began to think through this framework, it changes a way how we look at life and what is important in life. Because I understand life isn't just something temporary. Actually, if I invest in quality actions, I'm actually investing not only in the quality of my life now, but in my future too. And at the heart of spirituality, I would say, is the self-realization, the realization of my permanent self. And what I find in meditation, to experience, not just know, not just believe, but taste the feeling that I always exist, the feeling that I'm immortal, the feeling that the reality of the self is that I'm a non-physical being. And in a way, this, I think, helps me with the meaning of life and understanding the mystery of death. And I'm going to put a full stop to myself there. Otherwise, I will go on too long. So,
well, you justify the subject, I feel, because it is so broad that it connects, doesn't it? Because this, what you mentioned at the end, this taste, and the feeling that the I, the real I, always exists, seems to connect to the happiness that you mentioned at the beginning. And yesterday also in this near-death experience, that was his realization that we're here for joy. This is like a play, he mentioned. He felt this was like a theater. You mentioned hologram, it's like another realm. So putting a voice, and I don't, most of the people on this call are probably in the half of the world that don't have this concept of reincarnation as a prevalent philosophy. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, because it is a huge thing to start to grapple with. But even if you are in a culture where it's in the air, still the reality of it. And then you mentioned body consciousness, meaning that fear is there, right there. If we feel we can lose the costume, then we think that is I. So yeah, we really welcome all your thoughts, comments. Anyone would like to share? Maybe someone on this call who had a near-death experience even, but it's not just about that. Maybe also a spiritual clarity about this. But I have a question meanwhile about fear and its role, because certainly transcending it is needed to have the quality of life we wish for, and that allows us to love. But often we use fear sometimes to be motivated or against a sense that we might not have any accountability if this is just a drama when we can do anything and we leave and we get another costume. So any thoughts on that? And just a reminder for the translation, just to keep it a sort of a slowish pace would be great.
Yes, I think that, fear is a massive part of the soul's story. Because I think when the soul, if I develop this concept that that's the permanent self, the true self, and the soul identifies with the temporary self. And when you really look at how we build an identity through life, at every moment we're sort of creating this persona, this sense of identity. The more I identify and actually, am attached to that identity. I build this incredible account of fear. And as I was really talking right at the end there, that in my subconscious, I carry my story. It's like I carry this extraordinary story in my memory tract. All my experiences are really sitting, laid out in my memory tract. And the habit of fear has become an incredibly powerful thing. And in a sense, the more fear I have, I would say the more I understand the unfinished business of my past story is sitting there. Fear tells me how much karma of my past is still sort of unfinished, so to speak. It's the outstanding account. And yet, to me, one of the things which I've been exploring over many years, because I've done experiments in the laboratory of my mind, is I did it for months and months and months, is coming to terms with the feeling of always existing, the feeling of eternity. And that's an incredible thing. The human soul's eternal, the unit of matter is eternal. And what I noticed is that the more I don't just believe it intellectually, but I feel it in meditation. I feel the reality. I experience, I taste the sense of eternity. The whole account of fear starts to lose its grip. And it obviously doesn't do it quickly because it's habitual patterns. And it's not just the fear of losing my body, but as we know, there's numerous fears. But in a way, I see the spiritual journey, one way of understanding it is dismantling all these fears that I built up based on ignorance, because fear is based mainly on loss. And yet, when I understand, like the train journey, I can't ever own anything. So I can't really ever lose anything. Now, it's easy to say I know, but I think the more I practice this idea of or meditation and experience the self, then really we begin to dismantle the power of fear in my life. That's freedom. To be free from fear, even some of my fears, is an incredible freedom in life. Because I think a lot of life these days, we dance to the tune of our fears. So many of our life decisions are based on fear. They're not based on wisdom or truth. But I dance around all my fears and anxieties and worries. And so the quality of my decision-making is not that great sometimes because of body consciousness, because of the wrong sense of self that I carry. It's a seed which pollutes almost every part of my life.
And maybe connected to that, the subject of some kind of judgment comes in, certainly with the Western traditions and maybe in all traditions, this judgment and when we pass on to the next whatever transition. So do you want to share on that? Because that can also be misunderstood.
Yeah, I think it's a very deep thing, really, because if I understand that I'm a soul and I carry my story in my memory tract, I would say that the original state of the self is self-conscious, self-aware, which means I am free of fear, I'm happy, and I do elevated actions as a result. But my conditioned state now is body conscious, full of fear and negativity and anger and hurt and a whole range of emotional stuff. And so, sometimes knowing there's an intuitive sense of what I can be, an intuitive sense that I can be better than I am now. And so when I see my present self, I judge myself subconsciously against that original self or a sense of a better self that I carry internally. And this is why sometimes this incredibly harsh self-judgment, the big battle of human life is to maintain a sense of self-value. And we have this incredible ability to be so confident, so articulate, run organizations, pass exams. We're confident to do things. It doesn't mean I like who I am. And this is one of the great paradoxes of the contemporary world, that because of this self-judgment internally, I not only dislike, I can even have a hatred for parts of myself. And so I perform in the world with confidence, and yet my relationship with myself is so unhealthy. My take on the world, personally, is that if we have 8 billion human souls with a dysfunctional relationship with self, what do we get? That dysfunction, that lack of health spiritually flows into my health, flows into my relationships, flows into my family, flows into my work, flows into each and every part of life. And this is why I feel that the spiritual journey is the most important thing at this time, to engage with my fundamental self and begin to unravel a lot of the stuff that I carry in my subconscious, my karmic story, my fears. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes patience. And yes, it's not that easy. But to me, it's the most important thing in life, in a way. The meaning of life.
Yeah, how you turn that subject into self-judgment, and that is the harshest critic, at least what we know of right now. And I've been also reflecting, we have to accept or appreciate the ugly and the beautiful that is there from, in everyone's journey. Connected with this, there's a question, connected in my mind. What is the purpose then of taking all these different births and different bodies, if it's going to implied maybe lead to perhaps this decrease in consciousness, perhaps because of this getting caught up with the roles? So what's the purpose of these different bodies?
Well, we could almost say that about life in general, and almost what is the purpose of us doing anything, being anything? But I would say, you touched on it, Sarah, that as the soul, I think a lot of sometimes the idea is that as we go on the journey of life, we grow and learn. But actually, when I began to study with the BKs, the opposite idea was offered. That actually, in time, as the soul takes birth and rebirth, the sense of body consciousness grows. And actually, the more I become body conscious, I lose my spiritual power, I lose my happiness. And the soul becomes like spiritually bankrupt in that way. And I would say the purpose is we get to a point where I think there's such a superficial understanding of life, that I'm just a temporary body for one birth. And that really, in a sense, takes me to the point to really explore a completely different, shall we say, idea of who I am. And ultimately, the purpose is to realize who I am. And I would say even have a relationship with God. To me, that's a recipe to find a permanent happiness in a world that's constantly changing. Just to know the self, experience the self, know God, experience this relationship. And sometimes I think in this world, they're the two anchors. Once I put these anchors down, no matter how much world, life, relationships, opinions swirl around me, when I've built my life on that which always exists, rather than temporary things, then I can know a sense of stability. And I would say we have to sometimes reach a point to really really realize I need to maybe step back and review my understanding of almost everything, which I think is a really healthy thing to do, because sometimes we're not happy, and yet we think we all, as they say, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. If you think in the same way, you're always going to end up in the same place. Let me explore different ideas. They may not eventually ring true to me, but I think it's a really healthy thing to really step out of the box and explore a different perception, because it seems to me that the way we live life and the concept of life today is not bringing anyone much happiness or well-being.
Very nice. I really like this point that when we have just, say, one life, a concept actually creates a very superficial understanding of even life. We talk about YOLO, so it's just, experience, and it's just a kind of another hit and another hit. Very, very interesting. Some questions coming up. How would you deal with past phobias, for example, from early childhood in this life, which come up as challenges that we need to resolve?
At one point, my understanding, psychology used to call phobias irrational fears. But phobias are directly connected to experiences of the past. And, I remember once I was in outside Sydney in the Blue Mountains. The Brahma Kumaris have a beautiful retreat center there. It's a World Heritage area. And this great big Aussie bloke came to do some work on the property. And I remember he sort of said, oh, it's magnificent, has a waterfall and really spectacular environment. And he said, such a beautiful place, but I wouldn't want to live here. I thought, oh, that's weird. And I said, why? And he said, spiders. He said, I'm an arachnophobiac. And, there's over 400 of these phobias, as I was mentioning, and they are like, they're psychologically seeded, usually I would say in a past life experience. And we could go into great detail about this, but I remember one woman came to our meditation center, and she was saying that she'd had a lifelong problem with her throat. And she'd gone to every imaginable specialist, the so-called best medical specialist. Nothing changed with her throat. And eventually she went to a person, a psychologist who was a hypnotherapist, who took her back into her past. And she said that as a part of that journey, she found that some few hundred years back, she had been menacled somewhere in Europe. In other words, they put a metal thing around her neck against a wall. And she said, as soon as she heard that, somehow most of the problem went. And I think that when we sort of have the framework, I'm a soul on a journey, a lot of the things of fear in this life are seeded in the past. But when I understand I've collected these things, I remember one woman also telling me, in Australia, as you know, that people live around the sea, and little kids, literally before they walk, they learn to swim for safety. And this mother was telling me she had 4 kids, and kids just love water. They take to water like ducks, 3 of them loved it. One of a little girl, she said whenever she put her near the water, she would freak. And she began to think that, they're from the same parents, the same genes, everything's the same. Why is there such an incredible tantrum? And we began to talk that soul had some experience with water in the past that's recorded in the subconscious. So it's not logical. And when you think of fear, often it's not logical why I feel so uncomfortable. Some people feel so uncomfortable expressing their opinion. Others, as you know, are very happy to express their opinion, but some people feel very terrified because maybe they've been in a culture, maybe they've been a child or a woman or someone in a culture where the culture doesn't really, it restricts you, the part you are playing in expressing your views, etc. And it helps you understand, when you have an understanding of the soul and you're carrying these stories, it helps you sort of come to terms with why I feel so uncomfortable in certain situations that other people don't, or so fearful in certain situations that others just absolutely find easy to deal with. There's numerous stories about these things, which to me make a lot of sense as to why I feel in the present. They're embedded in my story, in my subconscious that I carry, the soul carries.
To hear the follow-up, any comments on that? The understanding we don't have to have the past life regression, but this broad picture that you mentioned gives context and also the option to transcend this different stories and touch that ground. And as you mentioned earlier, that taste of the feeling of always existing. It's such, even saying it's like each time just challenging that limited understanding of mortality and the fear. Someone commented that fear may not be always of dying or the death process, but the pain which may be experienced as part of that transition. So if you have any comments on that.
I totally agree. I think, death is definitely a major fear for most of us, but underlying that fear is the loss of the sense of identity that I've invested a lifetime in, a reputation, achievements, all that I spent a whole lifetime investing in. And also, yes, the pain that's associated, fear of authority figures is a huge thing for many people in life. There's just so many numerous fears, there's no doubt. But I do think the more I'm on the journey of self-realization and the relationship with God, I sort of begin at least to understand the context of my fear. And that helps me start to at least the journey of unpacking that fear and coming to terms with it. Not that I'm dancing to the tune of it. So when it comes inside, I'm sort of paralyzed by that fear and I just let it take me over. But I can start to at least give it some context of why it is with me and how I can actually deal with it. Fear of pain is a huge thing. But I do, many people who practice soul consciousness say that it can lessen the impact of bodily pain. I won't take it away, but, it's almost, once again, you put into the context of, it's a part of my story, a part of my story, my accounts from the past that I'm settling in the present.
Yes, that's what the comment includes, actually. When we understand that, it may be alleviating, but also, as you mentioned, in practice of meditation, that when there is a lift of consciousness, like the pain experience is inevitable, but the misery associated is a choice. To paraphrase Christopher Reeves, who commented something similar. Also was interesting in this near-death experience watched recently that she said she was very much suffering physically, but the next second when she came out of her physical body and saw from above, it was completely gone and replaced by bliss. And that typical NDE of going into the tunnel just love and bliss and freedom. It was nothing. It's if, as you mentioned in the context, it's not pressing on the mind at all, and it's part of the journey. Hard to grasp, actually, in the ordinary consciousness that she's trying to express what she had felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything you want to add?
No, sorry, Sarah. Yeah, it's amazing, many times, because all these years taking courses in meditation, so many people have shared with me about near-death experiences. And many, because as you framed it at the beginning, because perhaps we've grown up in a culture where this stuff is not talked about, or perhaps seems, not accepted. I remember my own aunt told me she had a major operation. She said, I left my body. And she was such a simple person. It was just out of the box for her. And I remember she said to me, she knew what I was into. She said, you're the only person I've told, because I think everyone else will think I'm mad. But she was such an authentic human being. And she had no context of being beyond her body and still aware. And so when I offered her the idea of the soul, it was incredibly, incredibly supportive for her. It was really something which she appreciated.
That's really nice. And a couple of questions that have come, and then amazingly an hour has gone by, so we can also have some meditation. This may be a simple question. After death, does the soul take a new body immediately based on karma? Also, do we meet again the souls that we met in past lives?
Oh, all these questions, we could go on and on and on. There's a man I know here in Australia who's a hypnotherapist, or he's a psychologist, and he didn't believe in any of this stuff. And he began to regress some people, and they would speak. They were born and bred in Australia, never left the country. And some of them would speak in Chinese or in French with an accent of, hundreds of years ago. And he became fascinated by this, and he made some films about it. And they were shown all over the world. And I'm so sorry, Sarah, I've lost my train of thought.
A huge subject. Yes, I think the original question, does the soul take immediate rebirth, and is it based on our karma?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. And yes, my understanding is that the soul's non-material. So time and space, it's beyond those. So it's instant, it will take rebirth. But sometimes, if the soul has had a very traumatic death, or the soul is particularly attached to something, and hence why people often say, they see ghosts around graveyards, this is sort of this type of thing, because sometimes souls are deeply attached to the body, because that's how they've seen themselves. And sometimes they hang around in this way. But generally, the soul will take rebirth. It leaves the body. And sometimes I have the thought, you're with a family who's having so much sadness at the loss of a loved one. And you're with another family who's just so happy at the birth of a child. It's a wonder, isn't it? This incredible game of life. And the soul leaves the body, goes into the womb, a few months later is reborn, and begins a whole nother journey. Yes, so I believe it's all karmic. Where we go, it's my karma, my actions. And that's where really I have control over my destiny, by the actions I perform now. My actions are creating my future.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Maybe this, you touched on it as well with the hypnotherapist. you gave that example earlier. Do you recommend exploring our past in this way with a hypnotherapist? Because it seems to be in line with awakening and perhaps releasing. Do you have any comments?
Not really, unless, because I think the whole aim of spirituality is to clear the account I've collected. And it's almost like we're all trying to be happy in the present, but we all carry this massive debt based on perhaps actions thinking I was a body. And so when I do that, my actions are colored with a lot of ego and fear and all this sort of pollution of the soul spiritually. Unless there's some sort of major trauma that can't be really cleared, something I've carried a lot of my life. Sometimes if I feel that I need to understand more deeply something about this, then yes, but ultimately, I think rather than going to every little account I carry like a tree with thousands of leaves, we've got thousands of these sort of stories of the past. It's not very environmentally friendly, but if I meditate and become so conscious, like I cut the tree off at the roots, I cut the tree of karma off at the roots. And that's why really I would say one reason for meditating is I feel the peace in the present, but the main reason is to start to clear the backlog that I'm carrying in my subconscious, which is like a shadow over my present and making me dance to the tune of habits created in the past, habits of fear, habits of hopelessness. All these are recorded in the habitual patterns in my subconscious. The spiritual journey helps free myself from that.
Love the image of a tree, this coming to the seed, and you'll get connected to your truth, whereas in this expansion, and we called it the karmic tree, there's so much confusion and the branches are all friction against each other. So very helpful, beautiful image. So we've come to time, I think. There may be something you want to add, and one thing I wanted to share, quote by J.K. Rowling: "To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure."
Exactly. And you know, I remember what I was forgetting about that guy who made the films, just that one woman brought her little 2-year-old boy to him. And she said that as soon as he began to speak, he used to say, "Mummy, I was your daddy." And the family thought this was hysterical. They just would laugh. But when he became quite determined, he wouldn't let it go. She took him to a hypnotherapist. And according to him, that was the case. And this does happen, not all the time, but we have accounts with people. And sometimes we will be reborn to those people that we are close to, not always by any means, but we have accounts with individuals. That's another whole huge story. So anyway, I'll finish there.
For the next chapter, yes, very interesting. And this creates a field, isn't it, that we want to for ourselves do our research, as you mentioned, in the laboratory of the mind, and we take back power regardless of prevalent culture and the beliefs. If we work with what is true for us, then, as you say, it's not a mystery anymore, but it's your ongoing journey of joy. And ultimately, what is true will survive, will flourish, and we can help others to get into their beautiful truth. So thanks so much for sharing, and for everyone for sharing space and creating this atmosphere, and questions as well, and translation. We've had translators running beside us. Thank you so much. If Charlie, you'd like to share perhaps a few words of meditation, I will also share in the chat about upcoming online retreat and online course options, and where you can find the recording So yeah, over to you, Charlie, for some reflection to close. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. So just for a couple of minutes, let us put down devices, distractions, and let me visualize the eternal self. This minute spark of consciousness that I am, sitting lightly in the center of the forehead. And in this sweet place of self-awareness, let me reflect on the extraordinary journey that I, the soul, have been on, that brings me to this point of time. Who am I? I am a collection of my past experiences, my original past, my original self is a being of purity, love, and happiness. But as I went on the journey of life after life, slowly I forgot who I was. I began to think I was the temporary body. And this seed of falsehood has polluted each and every part of my life. Now is the time to reconnect with my true self, my permanent self, and live in soul consciousness. Let me sit every morning when I wake and experience the permanent self acting through this hologram. And as I step into the day, let me carry the awareness of who I am into each part of my life. The more I become soul conscious, the clearer I am about the meaning of life and the mystery of death. Om Shanti.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Yeah. Feel free to come in camera. It'd be lovely to see you where you're joining from. Some information in the chat. So until next time, Charlie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Love to Prashant also. Bye-bye. Thank you.